long ago, Moses went up Mount Sinai, and Moses on Mount Sinai received the Ten Commandments on those tablets. And now Moses in Deuteronomy and this weekend's readings is telling the people to observe the commandments carefully. You have Jesus in the gospel today saying, you disregard God's commandments. Both Moses and Jesus have this awareness about how the commandments of God are being observed, or for that matter, not being observed. Moses, when he came down Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, after just hearing the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob say to him, you shall not have strange gods before me, comes down the mountain, and there he sees the people worshiping a golden calf. Moses aggravated about this, that the people are not abiding by the commandments. Observe them carefully. Jesus, looking around, knowing these 10 commandments that he will summarize as love of God and love of neighbor, you disregard God's commandments. Not only have Moses and Jesus in the scriptures called our attention to the Ten Commandments, but also the Mother of God has called our attention to them. I always tell the story of an apparition in Les Lau, France, that took place between the years 1664 and 1718. Periodic apparitions received by a young woman turned aged woman. Her name was Benedicta Ronquerolles. And Benedicta, in one of these apparitions of the many apparitions she received, was instructed by the Mother of God, who called herself the refuge of sinners, was instructed by the Mother of God to go to this particular woman. So imagine Mary comes to Benedicta. She's in this one spot, and right over here, there is a woman. And Mary looks at that woman and says, I want you to tell her that there will be no heaven for her if she doesn't stop taking the name of God in vain. Imagine that mission given to Benedicta. Confront this woman who's older than you, confront this woman. Maybe Benedicta knew who she was and knew her family. But here Benedicta is going to call this woman out. Like Moses, observe these commandments carefully. Like Jesus, you disregard God's commandments. Now Benedicta, because the Mother of God has revealed this to her, goes over to that woman and tells her, in the apparition I just received of Our Lady, she told me that there will be no heaven for you if you don't stop taking God's name in vain. That woman, hearing that message from Our Lady through Benedicta Ronquerolles, in that moment immediately changes her life. In that moment, she decides to never take the name of God in vain again. It also happened in an apparition in La Salette in France in 1846. Our Lady appears to two children, Melanie and Maxim. And in this apparition of Our Lady, she's weeping, she's crying over the sins of the people. She's crying about punishment that might come our way because of sin. And she says to these two children visionaries, she says, first of all, that people aren't going to Sunday Mass, that during the summers especially, they don't go to Mass, and only during the winters. And then she spoke of the name of God. She said, those who drive the carts, cannot swear without introducing the name of my son. So you have a Marian apparition calling our attention to two of the 10 Commandments: the Sabbath, keeping holy the Sabbath, and then fostering a greater respect for the name of God. You and I, we all know these 10 Commandments. We've learned them throughout our grade school years and high school years. We see them in monuments like the one outside of Sacred Heart Church. And so we're constantly reminded of the commandments. Maybe you don't know them in the exact order, but you would be able to tell me many of those commandments, maybe just out of order. But I think maybe this weekend is a good time to revisit those commandments. How is my love of God and my love of neighbor? Do I tell the truth? Do I take the name of God in vain? How have I committed some of these sins that are presented in the 10 Commandments? At the end of our gospel today, Jesus goes and kind of rattles off a list. He talks about unchastity and theft and murder, licentiousness. Maybe we go through that list and perhaps identify each one of those things with a commandment. But just to go through that and say, of these, am I guilty of any? We know that when we break God's commandments, one of the things we can do as Catholics is we can go to the sacrament of reconciliation, that we can confess our sins, that we can receive God's mercy, that we can start again, that we get a do-over in which we try to live these commandments more faithfully. I think for you and me, maybe this week, we focus especially on that commandment about the name of God, rooting out the ill use of it, using the name of God only in a prayer, rooting it out because if what Mary told Benedicta Ronquerolles to tell that woman, there will be no heaven for her, well, I want heaven. And I want to say the name of God in heaven, in its proper form, in its proper way. Our opening prayer today told us that, or asked God rather, that we might have a greater love of his name, that we might give his name due reverence. Let's focus on that this week and this month and the rest of our life. Let us observe these commandments carefully and no longer disregard them, but allowing them to guide every step of our life.